the Nigel Farage-led Nationalist United Kingdom Independence Party made big gains in elections, largely at the expense of the Conservatives. Eurosceptics in Britain were also alarmed by British financial obligations that had come about as a result of the EU's response to the Eurozone debt crisis and the bailout of Greece, 2009-12. They argued that Britain had relinquished too much of its sovereignty. Moreover, they were fed up with what they saw as excessive EU regulations on consumers, employers, and the environment. The Labour and Liberal Democratic parties generally favoured remaining within the EU, and there were still many Conservatives, Cameron among them, who remained committed to British membership, provided that a minimum of reforms could be secured from the UK's 27 partners in the EU. Having triumphed in the 2015 UK general election, Cameron prepared to make good on his promise to hold a referendum on EU membership before 2017, but first he sought to win concessions from the European Council that would address some of the concerns of those Britons who wanted out of the EU, an undertaking Cameron characterized as mission possible. In February 2016, EU leaders agreed to comply with a number of Cameron's requests, including, notably, allowing the UK to limit benefits for migrant workers during their first 4 years in Britain, though this so-called emergency brake could be applied only for 7 years. Britain also was to be exempt from the EU's ever-closer union commitment, was permitted to maintain the pound sterling as its currency, and was reimbursed for money spent on Eurozone bailouts. With that agreement in hand, Cameron scheduled the referendum for June 2016 and took the lead in the Remain campaign, which focused on an organization called Britain Stronger in Europe and argued for the benefits of participation in the EU's single market. The Leave effort, which coalesced around the Vote Leave campaign, was headed up by ex-London Mayor Boris Johnson, who was widely seen as a challenger for Cameron's leadership of the Conservative Party. Johnson repeatedly claimed that the EU had changed out of all recognition from the common market that Britain had joined in 1973, and Leavers argued that EU membership prevented Britain from negotiating advantageous trade deals. Both sides made gloom and doom proclamations regarding the consequences that would result from their opponents' triumph, and both sides lined up expert testimony and studies supporting their visions. They also racked up celebrity endorsements that ranged from the powerful U.S. Pres. Barack Obama, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde on the Remain side, and former British Foreign Minister Lord David Owen and Republican U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump on the Leave side, to the glamorous actors Benedict Cumberbatch and Sir Patrick Stewart backing the Remain effort, and actor Sir Michael Caine and former cricket star Ian Botham being in the Leave ranks. Opinion polling on the eve of the referendum showed both sides of the Brexit question fairly evenly divided, but, when the votes were tallied, some 52% of those who voted had chosen to leave the EU. Cameron resigned in order to allow his successor to conduct the negotiations on the British departure. In announcing his resignation, he said, "I don't think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination."
To its knees.
Theresa May's Brexit failure. The road to the Chequers plan. Although Johnson had appeared to be poised to replace Cameron, as events played out, Home Secretary Theresa May became the new leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister in July 2016. May, who had opposed Brexit, came into office promising to see it to completion. On March 29, 2017, she formally submitted a 6-page letter to European Council Pres. Donald Tusk invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, thus opening a 2-year window for negotiations between the UK and the EU over the details of separation. In the letter, May pledged to enter the discussions constructively and respectfully, in a spirit of sincere cooperation. She also hoped that a bold and ambitious free trade agreement would result from the negotiations. Get a Britannica premium subscription and gain access to exclusive content. Subscribe now. Attempting to secure a mandate for her vision of Brexit, May called a snap election for Parliament for June 2017. Instead of gaining a stronger hand for the Brexit negotiations, however, she saw her Conservative Party lose its governing majority in the House of Commons and become dependent on confidence and support from Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, DUP. May's objective of arriving at a cohesive approach for her government's Brexit negotiations was further complicated by the wide disagreement that persisted within the Conservative Party, both on details related to the British proposal for separation and on the broader issues involved. Despite forceful opposition by hard Brexiters, a consensus on the nuts and bolts of the government's Brexit plan appeared to emerge from a marathon meeting of the cabinet in July at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat. The working document produced by that meeting committed Britain to ongoing harmonization with EU rules and called for the creation of a joint institutional framework, under which agreements between the UK and the EU would be handled in the UK by British courts and in the EU by EU courts. Although the proposal mandated that Britain would regain control over how many people could enter the country, it also outlined a mobility framework that would permit British and EU citizens to apply for work and for study in each other's territories. May's softer approach, grounded in policies aimed at preserving economic ties with the EU, looked to have won the day, but in short order the government's apparent harmony was disrupted by the resignations of Britain's chief Brexit negotiator, David Davis, who complained that May's plan gave up too much, too easily, and Foreign Secretary Johnson, who wrote in his letter of resignation that the dream of Brexit was being suffocated by needless self-doubt. Confronted with the possibility of a vote of confidence on her leadership of the Conservative Party, May reportedly warned fellow Tories to back her Brexit plan or risk handing power to a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government. In November, the leaders of the EU's other member countries formally agreed to the terms of a withdrawal deal, the Chequers Plan, that May claimed delivered for the British people, and set the United Kingdom on course for a prosperous future. Under the plan, Britain was to satisfy its long-term financial obligations by paying some $50 billion to the EU. Britain's departure from the EU was set for March 29, 2019, but, according to the agreement, the UK would continue to abide by EU rules and regulations until at least December 2020, while negotiations continued on the details of the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. The Northern Ireland backstop plan and the challenge to May's leadership. The agreement, which was scheduled for debate by the House of Commons in December, still faced strong opposition in Parliament, not only from Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, and the DUP, but also from many Conservatives. Meanwhile, a call for a new referendum on Brexit was gaining traction, but May adamantly refused to consider that option, countering that the British people had already expressed their will. The principal stumbling block for many of the agreement's opponents was the so-called Northern Ireland backstop plan, which sought to preserve the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement by maintaining an open border between Northern Ireland and EU member Ireland after Brexit. The backstop plan called for a legally binding customs arrangement between the EU and Northern Ireland to go into effect should the UK and the EU not reach a long-term agreement by December 2020. Opponents of the backstop were concerned that it created the possibility of effectively establishing a customs border down the Irish Sea by setting up regulatory barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. The issue came to the fore in the first week of December, when the government was forced to publish in full Attorney General Geoffrey Cox's legal advice for the government on the Brexit agreement. In Cox's opinion, without agreement between the UK and the EU, the terms of the backstop plan could persist indefinitely, leaving Britain legally prevented from ending the agreement absent EU approval. This controversial issue loomed large as the House of Commons undertook 5 days of debate in advance of a vote on the Brexit agreement scheduled for December 11. With a humiliating rejection of the agreement by the House of Commons likely, on December 10 May chose to dramatically interrupt the debate after 3 days and postpone the vote, promising to pursue new assurances from the EU regarding the backstop. The opposition responded by threatening to hold a vote of confidence and to call for an early election, but a more immediate threat to May's version of Brexit came when a hardline Brexit faction within the Conservative Party forced a vote on her leadership. Needing the votes of 159 MPs to survive as leader, May received 200, and, under Conservative Party rules, she could not be challenged as party leader for another year. The longer it remained unsettled, the more the matter of Brexit became the defining issue of British politics. With opinions on May's version of Brexit and on Brexit in general crossing ideological lines, both Labour and the Conservatives were roiling with internecine conflict. In pursuit of greater support in Parliament for her revised Brexit plan, May secured new promises of cooperation on the backstop plan from EU leaders. Agreement was reached on a joint legally binding instrument, under which Britain could initiate a formal dispute with the EU if the EU were to attempt to keep Britain bound to the backstop plan indefinitely. Another joint statement committed the UK and the EU to arriving at a replacement for the backstop plan by December 2020. Moreover, a unilateral declaration by May's government stressed that there was nothing to prevent the UK from abandoning the backstop should negotiations on an alternative arrangement with the EU collapse without the likelihood of resolution. According to Attorney General Cox, the new assurances reduced the risk of the UK's being indefinitely confined by the backstop agreement, but they did not fundamentally change the agreement's legal status. Ongoing opposition to May's revised Brexit plan, deadline extensions, indicative votes, and May's resignation. On March 12, the House of Commons again rejected May's plan, 391 to 242, and the next day it voted 312 to 308 against a no-deal Brexit, that is, leaving the EU without a deal in place. On March 14 May barely survived a vote that would have robbed her of control of Brexit and given it to Parliament. On March 20 she asked the EU to extend the deadline for Britain's departure to June 30. The EU responded by delaying the Brexit deadline until May 22, but only if Parliament had accepted May's withdrawal plan by the week of March 24. In the meantime, on March 23 hundreds of thousands of demonstrators filled the streets of London demanding that another referendum on Brexit be held. On March 25, the House of Commons voted 329 to 302 to take control of Parliament's agenda from the government so as to conduct indicative votes on alternative proposals to May's plan. 8 of those proposals were voted upon on March 27. None of them gained majority support, though a plan that sought to create a permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union with the EU came within 6 votes of success. That same day May announced that she would resign as party leader and prime minister if the House of Commons were to approve her plan. On March 29 Speaker of the House John Bercow invoked a procedural rule that limited that day's vote to the withdrawal agreement portion of May's plan, thus excluding the political declaration that addressed the UK and EU's long-term relationship. This time the vote was closer than previous votes had been, 286 in support and 344 in opposition, but the plan still went down in defeat. Time was running out. By April 12, the UK had to decide whether it would leave the EU without an agreement on that day or request a longer delay that would require it to participate in elections for the European Parliament. May asked the EU to extend the deadline for Brexit until June 30, and on April 11 the European Council granted the UK a flexible extension until. After failing to win sufficient support from Conservatives for her Brexit plan, May entered discussions with Labour leaders on a possible compromise, but these efforts also came up empty. May responded by proposing a new version of the plan that included a temporary customs relationship with the EU and a promise to hold a parliamentary vote on whether another referendum on Brexit should be staged. Her cabinet revolted, and on May 24 May announced that she would step down as party leader on June 7, but would remain as caretaker premier until the Conservatives had chosen her successor. Boris Johnson and the Brexit finish line. May's successor as party leader and prime minister, Boris Johnson, promised to remove the UK from the EU without an exit agreement if the deal May had negotiated was not altered to his satisfaction. However, he faced broad opposition, even among Conservatives, to his advocacy of a no-deal Brexit. Johnson's political maneuvering, including proroguing Parliament just weeks before the revised October 31 departure deadline, was strongly countered by legislative measures advanced by those opposed to leaving the EU without an agreement in place. In early September, a vote of the House of Commons forced the new Prime Minister to request a delay of the British withdrawal from the EU until January 31, 2020. Despite the fact that on October 22 the House approved, in principle, the agreement that Johnson had negotiated, which replaced the backstop with the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, a plan to keep Northern Ireland aligned with the EU for at least 4 years from the end of the transition period. In search of a mandate for his vision of Brexit, Johnson tried and failed several times to call a snap election.